like to turn now to the question of balance of power. And I must say that balance of power is something that's used all the time in analyses of international politics, but it may be a little bit like an anniversary card that my wife once sent me, which when you looked at it on the outside, it said, "You're the answer to my prayers." And then you opened it up and it said, "But you're not exactly what I prayed for." And I think that is something we'll find as we try to understand the concept of balance of power. It's perhaps the most frequently used concept in theories of international politics, but it's often very confusing. David Hume, the great 18th century Scottish philosopher who was in the realist tradition, said that balance of power was a constant rule of prudent politics. Richard Cobden, a 19th century British liberal, called the balance of power a chimera, an undescribed, indescribable, incomprehensible nothing. So there are some differences of view about the balance of power. Certainly it's a term that's very loosely thrown around. It's often used to justify all sorts of things. The liberals, like President Woodrow Wilson, objected to its evil effects, as he saw it. In Wilson's term, the balance of power cuts up nations like cheeses, and what's more, it causes war. Certainly the balance of power does not necessarily produce peace. Over the last 500 years of the modern international state system, there have been 119 wars involving great powers. Or another way of looking at it is peace has been prevalent in only 1/4 of those 500 years. And 9 of those 119 wars were large general wars, the kind that I call hegemonic wars, which involve most of the great powers. Nor has the balance of power always preserved the independence of states, or at least not of all states. For example, in the late 18th century, Poland was carved up between Russia, Austria, and Prussia. And more recently, if you want an example from this century, after Stalin and Hitler signed their pact in 1939, the effect in 1940 was not only a repartition of Poland, but the Soviets taking of the independence of the Baltic republics, something that's returning to haunt them to this day. So the balance of power has a checkered background. But before we can look more carefully at the balance of power, we have to look at what we mean by power, and the question of how we define power in international relations. Well, there's a definition of power that's often associated with the Yale political scientist Robert Dahl that is, in terms of behavior, the ability to get others to do what they otherwise would not do. And that is a frequently used definition of power, but it's often easier to determine before the fact than it is, after the fact than it is before the fact. Beforehand, we tend to assume that certain resources, if a country has certain resources, that it will be able to get others to do what they otherwise wouldn't do. And so there's another way of looking at power, which is a shorthand that statesmen often use, which is to say, or to talk about power as though it's a resource or attached to resources. So people will look at the population of a country, or its territory, or its natural resources, its economy, its military, its political stability, and use that as a surrogate for power. Now, statesmen often make estimates in those terms. They'll say Russia is more powerful than France, or the U.S. is more powerful than the Soviet Union. But they sometimes get it wrong. There's a saying in poker, to return to that analogy, that if you're beat on the board, get out. Meaning if you see that the other fellow has cards showing that are higher than yours, stop. You're going to lose. Now, another way of thinking of that in international politics, if you know you're going to lose a war, don't start it. And yet, losers often do start wars. And how can we explain that? Well, sometimes not all the cards are showing, and sometimes states will gamble. For example, in 1941, Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor, even though the United States was much stronger on most power resources than Japan, not because it misread those resources, but because it thought the Americans wouldn't fight, that they were in an isolationist mood, that they would suffer this defeat and turn away from Asia. So power is something which people or statesmen who are in the business often get wrong in their estimates. What's more, power resources change over time. The resources that are associated with power may change. For example, if you look in the 18th, or well, let's go back even earlier. Let's look in the 17th century and look at Spanish power. It was very heavily associated with the resources that came from control of the gold and silver bullion of the New World. If you look in the 18th century, French power was very heavily related to the higher French population in an agrarian type of economy. In the 19th century, British power was very much associated with the British preeminence in the Industrial Revolution. In the 20th century, American power has been very much associated with American preeminence in science and technology. I think you can make the argument that in the 21st century, the key power resources may be heavily related to information and the ability to quickly and flexibly use information in an economy. And that means that it's often difficult to know which of these resources are actually producing power. So when you're trying to tote up this balance of power, what do you tote up? What do you pay attention to? I think you can make the case that it's become more difficult to estimate power resources today than it was, say, in the 18th century. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, you had basically agrarian societies. And the material basis for power, as I mentioned, was largely population. It's interesting, if you go back to the Congress of Vienna in 1815, the Congress which brought together the states at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and look at the way the country of Prussia submitted a plan for its reconstitution. Prussia had been overwhelmed by Napoleon's France. Provinces had been taken away from it, and it submitted a list to the other countries assembled around the table in Vienna and said, these are the territories that we lost after 1805 that were taken away from us, and here's some territories that we could get back or that somebody could just give us to give us an equivalent number of peasants and possible infantrymen. And if we put all those together, then we will be restored to the situation we were, and we'll play our role in the balance of power. Now, it didn't matter at all to the Prussians who constructed the list or to the other great powers who agreed to it that many of the populations on the list didn't speak German at all. This was pre-nationalist, and essentially the idea was that if you had this much of population that you'd lost, you got this much population back, then you'd restore Prussia to its place in the balance of power. Now, over the course of the 19th century, it made it much more difficult to do that when you had the rise of nationalism. What I talked about, the changes in the process of international politics that went along with the rise of nationalism. So that by 1870, when Bismarck takes Alsace-Lorraine in the Franco-Prussian War and keeps it, it's not at all like when Prussia took or was given some of these provinces of non-German speakers, and it didn't seem to matter at the beginning of the century. So what we find then is that a number of things make the calculation of power more complicated, both social and economic and military changes over time, in terms of knowing what resources are most important. Over the course of the 19th century, industrial power and transportation systems also become more crucial. They become critical in terms of mobilizing a society for warfare. And that mobility in warfare becomes extremely important. So if you look at the assessments of power on the eve of World War I, Russia is by far the largest country, by far the largest economy in Europe, but it's an economy and country which isn't able to mobilize quickly. It doesn't have the web of rail networks. It doesn't have the ability to pull these things together that, for example, Germany had. And indeed, one of the things that makes the Germans begin to worry on the eve of World War I is when the French begin to give loans to the Russians, which allow the Russians to build a rich web of railways in the western part of Russia, which means they'll be able to pull these resources together and mobilize them more quickly. So again, when we're looking at power, you just can't look at the resources. You have to look also at the ability to mobilize those resources. Now, since 1945, in the nuclear age, obviously population, territory, resources matter. Industry still matters. But science and knowledge begin to play a larger role. And not just for war. We argued earlier, following Richard Rosecrans, that with the rise of the trading state and the muscle-bound nature of nuclear military power, that it may turn out that some of the factors that determine internal growth in countries may become increasingly important in judging the balance of power. For example, it's been pointed out that if the United States had a 5% rate of economic growth for 3 years, that would add more to American net resources in terms of GNP than the alliance with Great Britain does. And that then casts a somewhat different picture, a role of alliances. So what one asks is whether our ways of judging and assessing power, when we think of balance of power, have caught up with all the changes that go along with the differences in international politics that I described in the first lecture. Now, I think it leaves us still in a situation where you say that in a self-help system, that force is the most effective form of power when it's actually used, but it's often the most costly form of power. And in traditional terms, war was the time in international politics when all the cards were on the table face up, when you saw exactly whether your estimate of power resources was correct or incorrect. And when the states went to war, that essentially was a way of calling each other's bets as to whether the estimates or judgments of the balance of power resources was correct. In the nuclear age, war is too costly, at least for the major powers. And then you have the question of whether in the early parts of the nuclear age, sometimes crises played this role, the equivalent of war, for example, the Cuban Missile Crisis, but that's too risky as well. So we have a question of whether we really know how to measure or judge power resources and to get good assessments of the balance of power in a modern era. In short, we can define power clearly, but it's become more difficult to be clear about the relation of particular resources to it. That's something we want to think about again as we come to the last lecture. But let's go to the concept of balance of power. And it's worth remembering that the same word can often be used for different things. And unless we're clear about what we're using a word for, we can get awfully confused. And I think in that sense, if we're trying to understand the term balance of power, it's worth remembering that there are at least three things which are often referred to by the concept balance of power, and that whenever we speak about it, we ought to be clear in our own mind and to those with whom we're communicating which of these three meanings we mean. The first way in which balance of power is used is as a term for the distribution of power. Who has what resources? So you just say that one way of doing it is say any distribution of power is the balance of power. In that sense, it simply means the status quo. And when people talk about the change in the balance, they say something like, well, if the Soviets were to control Afghanistan, it would tip the balance of power, or if Vietnam were to escape from American influence, that would affect the balance of power. These are ways of saying if there's a change in the distribution of power, that is a change in the balance of power. It's a rather fuzzy and not very useful use of the concept. It's just saying a change in the status quo changes something. It doesn't really tell you whether things have been balanced or or what the resources that are critical are. Another way in which people use the balance of power in relation to distribution of power is to talk about an equal balance, as though they were scales, with is this a balance of power in some equilibrium? And the point is that in international history, it's been very rare that you've had exactly equal balances, and there's a fair degree of controversy about whether equal balance is or is not conducive to peace. Indeed, there's a school of thought, for example, represented by Kenneth Organsky at the University of Michigan, that says that the most stable periods in international politics are when things are unstable, when one is way above the other, because then the weaker is not likely to attack. It'll see that it would lose such a war. And that theory is often called power transition theory, which says that if you have an unbalanced distribution of power and it begins to catch up, or the lower gets closer, that may be the circumstances when war is more likely. And people who hold that theory will go back again to the father of all analysis of international politics, Thucydides in the Peloponnesian War, in which his explanation of the onset of the war between Athens and Sparta was that it was caused by the rise in the power of Athens and the fear that created in Sparta. So that as Athenian power went up and the Spartans became more afraid, this led to the tightening of the alliances and the bipolarity which preceded the war. And I imagine that Organsky and people who take this same view of power transition theory would say that World War I fits their explanation or their theory pretty well, that it was the rise in the power of Germany and the fear that created in the others, which was the underlying cause in World War I. But I would urge you to be a little bit wary about the theory as a whole. It's often important when we judge theories to remember dogs that don't bark, to quote Sherlock Holmes. And a theory, to be accurate, shouldn't merely fit the cases that happen, but it also should explain why certain cases didn't happen. And, for example, how do we explain on this theory the fact that the British and the Americans didn't go to war? Because what happens at the end of the 19th century is that Britain is gradually passed by the United States. Britain is up here, the United States there, and the positions are reversed. Now, you could say there was no opportunity for war, but if you said that, you would be wrong. Because, in fact, in 1895, the British and the Americans got into a dispute over the boundaries of Venezuela and the British colony of Guyana, and it looked like it might indeed be the kind of thing that could lead to an outbreak of war. But there wasn't. The British chose appeasement, appeasement being the approach of saying it's better to conciliate the United States. Appeasement doesn't always have to mean Neville Chamberlain in the 1930s. It's an old instrument that states use in diplomacy. The British appeased the Americans, and there was no war. The dog didn't bark, and for those theorists who say whenever you have an unbalanced balance and one creeps up on the other, that's likely to be war, this case doesn't fit. So we have to be careful about theories that are based on distribution of power. It may be a factor in explaining the onset of war, but it's not the sole factor. So in general, various uses of the term balance of power that refer to distribution of power, I tend to find not terribly useful, but it's worth remembering that that's one set of uses of the term. A way of using the term balance of power that I think is more useful is a way of predicting behavior of states. And that's to say that balance of power is a policy. It's a policy that says that states will act to prevent any one state from developing a preponderance of power. In other words, it's a prediction about what policy states will follow. And a good example of this would be the way Churchill brought Britain into an alliance with the Soviet Union as soon as Hitler attacked the Soviet Union in 1941. Remember, British and Soviet relations have been very bitter in the period before that. And Churchill was asked, how can you turn around, embrace this evil communist dictatorship, which you've just been criticizing, anathemizing in the House of Commons just recently, and now you're forming an alliance. And Churchill's response to that, which is a classic response that illustrates balance of power as a policy, what Churchill said is, if I learned that Hitler had invaded hell, I would manage to say something good about the devil in the House of Commons. Indeed, earlier in 1914, Sir Edward Grey, the British foreign minister at the time, chose to go to war on the principle that Britain could not afford to let Germany control the continent of Europe. That the idea that Germany, once it controlled the whole continent of Europe, would have a preponderant role which would be threatening for Britain was a central factor in Grey's decision to press for war. Another clear example of balance of power as policy. Now, what does that policy prediction rest on? The prediction that states will act to balance another. It's based on two assumptions. One is that you have an anarchic structure, no higher government above, so that you're having states that are thinking about self-help. And the second is that states place a prime value on maintaining their independence, that if they let some other state get too large, too preponderant, that will be a threat to them. And so the prediction is not that states will act to maximize power, but they'll act to prevent any one power from becoming preponderant. If all you wanted to do was to maximize your power, you might do the opposite of balance of power. The opposite of balance of power is bandwagoning. You jump on the bandwagon. You add all the power together to get some of the spoils. Balance of power predicts just the opposite of bandwagoning. It says, if I jump into this fray, I'm going to jump in not on the side of the big guy, not on the side of the strong guy, as in bandwagoning. I'm going to jump in on the side of the weaker side, what may be the losing side. That's the prediction of balance of power. In other words, it means that there are some risks that you take, but you take those risks as a way to preserve your independence. And there are two means that are classic in terms of strengthening a state in balance of power. One is to add to one's armaments, have an arms race, and the other is to form an alliance. So that if you say this country is getting too large, I can begin to rearm, and I can also make an alliance with another country against that country that's getting too large. But remember, the important point is that the balance of power as a policy predicts you join the weaker side. It's one of the most powerful predictions in international politics. Indeed, it works, for example, if you take it to the Middle East in recent times. If you ask yourself, why was it in the Iraq-Iran war that Syria, an Arab country, was aligned not with Arab Iraq, but was aligned with non-Arab Iran? Was it because of religion? No. Syria has a secular government. It's a Ba'athist party government, as Iraq has a Ba'athist party government. So why was it, how could you explain this anomaly that instead of fraternal solidarity among Arabs with Ba'ath government regimes, both relatively secular Arab governments, not divided by religion, why did Syria align itself with Iran, a bunch of Persians speaking a different language with a fundamentalist religious leader? Why would they do that rather than with their Arab brethren? Well, if you think in balance of power terms, the answer comes to you quickly and clearly. Syria was worried about the strength of Iraq. Iran was a way to balance growing Iraqi power. So ethnicity, Arabism or language, religion, these were not the factors. The reason that Syria became the ally of Iran and not of Iraq was because of balance of power. That may also help to explain why Syria sent troops to the Persian Gulf on the side of the United States, who it had been at odds with and anathemizing in terms of Middle East politics for such a long time. Has a lot more to do with Iraq and balancing Iraqi power than it does with belief in collective security or the UN Charter. So in that sense, balance of power as a prediction is not something just left over from history. It can help us to explain some anomalies in international politics in the current world as well. So it's probably one of the most powerful predictions that we have in international politics today. But it's also worth putting in the context of what I said in the first lecture, that there are no predictions in international politics that are deterministic or totally powerful. The problem with trying to understand international politics is that, unlike physics, we're in the realm of human choices. And human choices are not totally predictable. We can say that in certain situations, we can say certain types of behavior are more likely than others. Certain situations will predispose toward a type of behavior. If this theater catches on fire, I can predict that this audience will move to the exits. But I can't predict which person will go out which exit. Or indeed, if you all cluster to the same exit, whether any of you will make it. So in that sense, what we know is that in human behavior, there are certain predispositions that grow out of situations, as, for example, in balance of power, but the exact policies followed are not always predictable. So in that sense, I can think of at least 6 exceptions to the balance of power, 6 reasons why states don't always follow a policy of balance of power. And remember, in this case, we're using balance of power as the prediction that states will join the weaker against the stronger. So what are some of the reasons why that prediction is sometimes falsified? Well, one situation is if a state has no alternative, if it can't affect the balance. For example, after World War I, Belgium decided to be neutral because it felt that after its experience of being invaded in World War I, what was the difference of being an ally with the French or not? You weren't going to be protected. You might as well be neutral. Essentially, the feeling was that there wasn't much that could be done. You couldn't affect the balance. It was safer to be neutral. Or after World War II, Finland, having lost to the Soviets in the early stages of the Soviet-Finnish War, the beginning of World War II, the Finns felt that they were better not to try to join NATO, but to be neutral, because they couldn't really affect the balance toward the Soviets, and it was safer just to try to opt out of the situation. So a state may decide not to join the weaker side, not to put a coalition together because it feels it can't affect the difference very much. A second reason why a state may not follow a policy of balance of power is because of the perception of the threat. If you use simple or simplistic, just totaling up resources, and ask which side should the United States have joined in World War I, the United States probably should have joined Germany and Austria, because Germany and Austria had 19% of world industrial production, whereas Britain, France, and Russia had 30% of world industrial production. So in that sense, you might say, well, if we predict you join the weaker side, then we should have joined Austria and Germany. But in fact, the Americans perceived Germany as a larger military threat. And because of that military threat perception, we joined the economically stronger side in terms of total resources. A third reason why there may be exceptions to a policy of balance of power has to do with proximity. And that also relates to the earlier point about perceived threat. Your neighbor may be weaker on a global scale, but may be more of an immediate threat to you. So that if you go back to that case of trying to explain why did Britain appease the Americans as the Americans were rising in the end of the 19th century, well, one reason was because Britain had 2 things to worry about. It had to worry about the rise of American power, but it also had to worry about the rise of German power. German power was closer at home, or closer at hand. So if you're not going to fight 2 at the same time, better to keep your attention on the one nearby than the one that's further away. So proximity had something to do with the British assessment of which threat to look at. Or another example would be after 1945. After 1945, the United States came out of World War II much stronger than the Soviet Union. From 1945 to 49, we had a monopoly on the atomic bomb. The United States economy came out of World War II enormously strengthened by the war. The Soviets had lost 20 million people and their industry had been devastated. So if you ask which country was stronger at that time, it would look like, in terms of resources, the Americans were stronger. In that case, then, shouldn't the Europeans and the Japanese have joined with the Soviets, the weaker, against the United States, the stronger? Well, not in terms of proximity of the threat. From the point of view of the Europeans and the Japanese, seeing themselves as a peninsula and a set of islands at the two ends of the Eurasian landmass, the problem was not those distant Americans over in the other hemisphere. The problem was the near large controller of the Eurasian, the center of the Eurasian landmass. And that meant that essentially the Europeans and the Japanese turned to alliance with the Americans, even though the Americans were stronger, because they saw the Soviet threat as more proximate, much more immediate to them. So in that sense, the situation is one in which proximity may lead to different perceptions of threat, and that may lead to different predictions than a rather simplistic balance of power analysis would give you. A fourth reason why states may not follow a simplistic, just tote up the resources prediction of balance of power policy is short-run spoils. Sometimes the state will look at the situation and say, you know, if I bandwagon rather than balance, I can really get something out of it. I can get a payoff. So, for example, Mussolini in 1939 declared war on France. And his reason for declaring war on France was he wanted some of the spoils that were going to go along with Hitler's victory over France. You might have said Mussolini should see that Germany under Hitler is becoming the dominant power in Europe, and he should have made a balance with Britain and France to try to constrain Germany. Indeed, some of his behavior earlier in the 1930s were along these lines. But by 1939, he said, well, it looks like it's going to happen. I might as well get a payoff by getting a little chunk of France. So in that sense, he bandwagoned rather than balanced to, I suspect, his later regret, as he found when the Germans became so dominant that they paid little attention to him or his wishes for how they behaved in Italy. And that's the danger of bandwagoning, indeed, is that it may get you spoils or payoff in the short run, but it may mean that by not preventing the increased preponderance of the larger country, that you will pay for it later on. A fifth exception to predictions of a policy of balance of power have to do with economic behavior. Economic behavior is different from security behavior in some ways, in the sense that you do have a prospect of shared gains. In other words, if you're worried about in the security area of one state becoming larger, you want to keep that state down. In the economic area, the growth of Germany may be very good news for France. France and Germany are its major trading partners. In that sense, if you look at German and French behavior before and after World War II, it's very different. Germany and France before World War II would be very worried about the economic growth of the other. Today, a French president gets reelected primarily on the question of how the French economy is doing, which is true of most modern democracies. And how the French economy is doing has a lot to do with how the German economy is doing. So in that sense, does the French president, seeing Germany growing well, want to do things to sabotage the German economy? No, because through economic interdependence, it comes back and hurts himself. So in that sense, you could say that the balance of power prediction, which is that you should try to stop the other one from getting too strong, in this case doesn't work that way. You don't want to undercut your economic partner because it, through interdependence, will undercut yourself. So insofar as economic behavior is dominant, then balance of power predictions also don't work very well. And sixth and finally, as a cause for possible exception to a balance of power policy, is ideology. And then the question is, what difference does ideology make in international politics? Well, it makes some difference, but often it doesn't. For example, if we go back to that case of the dog that didn't bark in British-American relations in the 1890s, In addition to the proximity reason as to why the British and the Americans didn't fight, there was a certain degree of ideological linkage, common language, a degree of common culture, though remember this hadn't prevented us from fighting twice before, but there was something in that. Also, that ideology may have had some effect on the fact that the Americans chose to go into World War I in 1917 on the Allied side rather than on the side of the Central Powers. And I think you could argue that Europe after 1945, the choice of the Europeans to ally with the Americans had to do with the democratic ideology that was shared. So in that sense, ideology does play some role. But it would be a big mistake to think that ideology is all determining. One should beware of expecting too much from ideology. Sometimes balance of power politics will be a better prediction than ideological exceptions to balance of power. Let's take the Stalin-Hitler Pact of 1939. If you looked at that, the idea that in 1939 the Nazis and the communists, who were at the absolute opposite ideological ends of the political spectrum, would ally with each other seems totally implausible on ideological grounds. Yet they did. Why? You can explain it in terms of balance of power. In a three-party game, it seemed much better to shift the Hitler westward to Stalin than to worry about ideological purity. Similarly, if you look at East Asia, as we mentioned, the fact that the East Asian states, even though they're all communist, balance each other, an alliance between China and Cambodia against the Soviet Vietnamese alliance, also gives you a better prediction than ideology. Or go back to my Syrian Iranian example. So sometimes ideology may play a role, but often balance of power as a policy is more important. So by and large, I think that you could argue that while there are exceptions to the rule, that balance of power as a policy is a pretty good predictor, or at least one of the better predictors that we have in international politics. Now, the third meaning of the term balance of power, these generic meanings of the term, is sometimes the word balance of power is applied to a particular historical system, meaning the moderate multipolar system of 19th-century Europe. Sometimes that's called the classical balance of power, or the 19th-century balance of power. And in this sense, people will say, well, you know, there's no balance of power today because we live in a nuclear age or only two great powers, and that you need 5 states for a balance of power or something of that sort. When people say balance of power in those terms, they're using it as this description of a particular type of historical system. Now, it's important not to romanticize or ideologize or idealize the 19th century balance of power. It's true that the balance of power in 19th century Europe produced a longest interval without a general hegemonic war since 1500. You got basically a century without one of these huge world wars from 1815 to 1914. But it's a complex story. If one looks at it in terms of the structure of the international system, there were 3 different periods in the 19th century. From 1815 to 1870, you had 5 powers with no one dominant. After 1870, after the unification of Germany and Italy, from 1870 to about 1907, you had 6 powers, but basically beginnings of a rising concern about German power. And then from 1907 to 1914, a gradual rigidification of these alliances into bipolarity, tightening into 2 tightly opposed alliance systems. There were also interesting changes in the process of the 19th century balance of power. In 1815, the Congress of Vienna had tried to restore the principle of monarchical legitimacy and tried to equilibrate the system. Everybody should be brought back in, including France. France, the defeated country, was made a respected member of the balance of power after the Congress of Vienna. And from 1815 to 1822, you had the period that was often called the Concert of Europe, meaning not music, but concerted efforts, with frequent meetings to deal with disputes. And in an abbreviated form, it lasted until the revolutions of 1848, where liberal nationalism began to break it apart. And that was followed from 1854 to 1870 by a period of some turmoil, where there were 5 wars, which had to do with the reorganization of states along more nationalist lines, and the development of the uniting of Italy, the uniting of Germany. And from 1870 to 1890, you had the first effect of this new reconstituted balance, which was sometimes called Bismarck's system, or Bismarck's balance of power. And what Bismarck did to maintain his version of the 19th century balance of power was to try to keep Germany in the middle, as the key partner for everybody else. So he had multiple alliances. He had alliances with Austria and alliances with Russia, even though Austria and Russia were often at odds with each other. And he tried always to prevent any alliance between the French and the Russians, who were on each side of Germany. In fact, he encouraged the French to go overseas in imperialistic ventures, to divert their activities overseas. And he limited Germany's overseas imperialism, not wanting to get in head-on competition. And so in that sense, Bismarck had a very delicate, deliberate balancing act in the center of Europe, which led for a degree of moderation even after the structural change of the unification of Germany. The trouble with the last period that we're going to see, 1890 to 1914, in terms of the process of the 19th century European balance of power, is that Bismarck's successors weren't up to the game that Bismarck had designed for keeping stability in Europe. One of the first things they did was to drop the treaty with Russia. Bismarck called it his reinsurance treaty. Well, once you drop the treaty with Russia, the Russians become anxious. They become also available for the French to do an alliance on either side of Germany, and that was a poor choice by Bismarck's successors. A second thing they did was to challenge Britain with a naval arms-building policy. Admiral von Tirpitz felt that if he could have a successful naval buildup, this would make the British more cautious in the way they treated the Germans. The British would have to do more, be more respectful of the Germans. What he managed to do was to scare the British and to push the British toward a French-British alliance against Germany. A third change from Bismarck's policies was, instead of restricting German imperialism, his successors moved outward into what they called a Weltpolitik, a world politics, looking for a greater imperial place in the sun for Germany, demanding that Germany get this colony or that and a larger role, which brought them into conflict with a number of the other countries, particularly Britain and France. And finally, Bismarck's successors encouraged Austria and Austrian adventures in the Balkans, essentially not paying enough attention to the way that would bring Austria, Germany's ally, into conflict with Russia, which was also interested in the Balkans, and the kinds of results that that would produce. So what you saw then in the historical system of the 19th century balance of power was movement from what was a relatively moderate international system in the period of the concert of Europe to one which was structurally more tightly knit after the unification of Germany, but that was held as a stable system by Bismarck's successful moderate diplomacy, and where his successors changing the policies so that you challenged the various other European states brought on the coalitions against Germany that led to World War I. In effect, what you saw was the production in that last period from 1890 to 1914, after Bismarck was fired in 1890, of the various policies that produced first the Franco-Russian, and then the Franco-British, and then the Franco-Russian-British alliance after 1907, which, while there were still efforts to resolve crises, basically led to the onset of World War I. And what I'd like to do in the next lecture is to tell you about the onset of World War I.